Ian, you said India is one of the most exciting stories globally, but not the most exciting story globally. So which one to you is the most exciting story globally? And for policymakers and others who are watching at this moment, what would you like to see the next government do, no matter who comes to power, to take India from being one of the most exciting stories to being the most exciting story?
I'm not sure that Superman could make India the most exciting story. There just aren't enough Westerners here. There's not enough success stories historically here. It's still a comparatively small economy. You're on track to be number 3 by 2028-ish. That's still very far from number 2 and number 1. You also have enormous challenges in the next 10 years on water. You have enormous challenges in the coming years on climate. It is hot out. It is going to get hotter. These are not things that are fixable if you are India. It's not your fault. It's just a reality. But, you know, you ask me who else is hot, in the United States, the leading trade partner with the U.S. today is, anyone? Mexico, right? And Mexico is also having an election on June 2nd, and it's very predictable, not guaranteed, just like India, but fairly predictable, and that AMLO's preferred outcome, just like Modi's preferred outcome here, is likely to win. You only get one term in Mexico, so it's Claudia Sheinbaum. But that transition comes to a woman who also has a climate science background and understands a few things about the 21st century economy, 2 things that do not describe AMLO. So Mexico is becoming more integrated as almost a huge 51st state, with USMCA that has incredible benefits for continuing that supply chain and infrastructure. And then, of course, another big story is the U.S. The U.S. is a very attractive market because the Americans are subsidizing it as industrial policy and building semiconductors after forgetting about them for 20 years. The U.S. is in a part of the world that is geopolitically stable. India is not. Think about your borders. You know, Myanmar's hard. Pakistan is hard. China is hard, right? I mean, the United States has Mexico and Canada. The only geopolitical challenge borders which Americans decided not to care about, and they shipped the people back, which is really sad. And is not befitting American values historically, but is not a geopolitical instability. India has to spend a lot more on defense. Why? Look at your region. So, I mean, there are challenges with being India that don't go away no matter who you elect. I mean, that's an obvious reality.
Share your assessment of how the Indian government has handled foreign affairs over the last 10 years or last 5 years, and what are the challenges you foresee for India over the next 5?
Well, look, I mean, I think that I look at Modi and Abe, the strongest Japanese prime minister in modern history. And this was a guy as prime minister that was willing to come and visit Modi when he was running Gujarat, which was out of protocol for the Japanese. How amazing. This was a guy that was saying, I am going to build this relationship with the Japanese, who don't produce anything that's poor quality, don't produce anything cheap. How is that going to work? Modi found a way to make it work and to be trusted, and that built one of the strongest relations in the G20, which really matters. Well before the Americans really cottoned on to the India story. The Quad is, of course, a big piece of architecture that really helps to bring the Indians in strategically. And yes, India is buying an awful lot of oil from Russia, which is aligned with U.S. policy. The Americans are unprepared to pay a lot for Ukraine, and as a consequence, they're not prepared to try to shut down Russian oil export because they don't want $120 oil. They don't want a global recession. But India is also working much more closely with the Americans on issues of national security, on issues of defense, both in partnership in military exercises, but also in production. Those are valuable things that have happened under Modi. So I do believe that there has been a strong effort to build out more stable, more strategic relations with most of the advanced industrial democracies. At the same time, Modi and India and their success and their willingness to have a more global face, to have a more global strategy, whether at the COP summits or the G20 or in the BRICS or at Davos, all of that has been inspirational to developing countries that don't have that capacity and don't necessarily trust putting all their eggs in a China basket, especially because China's really big, but China wants a lot of political leverage with their economic influence. Most countries in the world, like India, do not want to choose between the United States and China. This is where I have the greatest disagreement with some of what
Fareed Zakaria
yeah.
argued, and you heard him saying very strongly that he believed India would grow faster if it attached itself to the US bandwagon. Most people sitting here, those watching you, would say, no, we like the sweet spot that India is in, where it is very good friends with the United States, and we build on that deep and abiding partnership. But we also want to keep a door open with Russia. We would like for tensions to come down with China. Even if that doesn't happen, we don't want to be on one country's wagon. How do you see this?
Well, I mean, you're not in Belt and Road, so you clearly don't really want, you're in the Quad but not in Belt and Road. That's like being a little bit pregnant, right? So, I mean, the idea of Indian neutrality is a myth. But you like being a little bit pregnant. I can see this is working in this conversation because, you know, that's a whole gender identity question. But when I think about where India is going long term, my difference with Fareed is saying bet more strongly with the United States and allies when it really matters strategically, and don't when it's going to get you in trouble with other countries that matter to you, right? So when I think about the future of globalization, India needs globalization. The United States is betting much more heavily on industrial policy. You just heard from Fareed, if Trump wins, internationally, he thinks the US is going to be more isolationist. Why would India want to bet heavily on that? That's dangerous to India. I think the future of the global economy will have AI that is dominated by the Americans, and therefore India should bet on it. And we'll have an energy transition that is dominated by the Chinese, and therefore India should bet on that. That's what the Europeans are going to do. The Americans put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And privately, the White House will say should have been 300%, should have been 400%. Why? I mean, is it because the Americans think that's the best way to ensure a green future? No, has nothing to do with green. Has everything to do with elections, protecting labor and automotive, and making China less competitive. The Europeans are likely to put more tariffs on Chinese EVs, 20, 25, 30%. Why not 100? I mean, wouldn't Fareed say 100? No. And they're not doing that because the Europeans recognize that they don't want their people to drive expensive, poorly made EVs. Now, if the United States decides that everyone in America has to drive a poorly made, expensive EV, there are enough Teslas for everybody, right? They can do that. But the rest of the world is going to drive Chinese. It's eventually going to happen. And not only that, but the battery technology and, you know, wind and solar and nuclear, China's increasingly driving that. But the Americans are driving AI.